The strange thing about disrespect is that it rarely begins with an insult. It begins with something much smaller, a joke that lands slightly wrong, an interruption in a meeting, a dismissive wave of the hand when you are still speaking, a comment that carries just enough edge to sting, but not enough to justify a response. And in that moment, that small, almost invisible moment, you make a choice. You let it pass. You tell yourself it was nothing. You decide that reacting would make you look sensitive, fragile, difficult. So you say nothing. And here is what most people believe happens next. They believe that the other person, having received no reaction, quietly moves on. That the silence communicated dignity, that rising above it demonstrated maturity. I want to tell you something about that belief. It is almost entirely wrong. Not because staying calm is wrong. Calm is actually one of the most powerful things you can do. But because what you taught the other person in that moment was not your dignity. You taught them your boundary. Or rather, you taught them that you do not have one. That is the hidden psychological truth underneath most disrespect. It is not primarily about rudeness. It is not about cruelty. It is not even about the other person disliking you. Disrespect is, in most cases, a test, a quiet, often unconscious probe of how much social territory you are willing to surrender. And if you surrender it once, the test will come again. This is where I want to begin. Not with how to respond to disrespect, but with what disrespect actually is. Because most people misunderstand it completely, and that misunderstanding is precisely why the disrespect continues. Let me describe something you will recognize immediately. A man sits in a meeting. He begins to make a point. A colleague, someone he has worked with for years, talks over him. Not aggressively, not with obvious hostility, simply begins speaking as if the first man had not been speaking at all. The room shifts its attention to the interrupter. The man who was cut off pauses, loses his thread, eventually goes quiet. Nothing dramatic has happened. No one shouted. No one insulted anyone directly. And yet something real has just occurred. What was it? Most people, if asked, would describe it as rudeness, a lack of consideration, bad social habits. Maybe the colleague was simply excited about his own idea and did not notice. But here is what I have observed across decades of studying human behavior. That explanation is almost never complete, because the interruption rarely happens randomly. It happens to specific people, consistently, in similar situations. And it almost never happens to the person in the room who carries the strongest social presence. Why? Because human beings, and I mean all human beings without exception, are constantly running an unconscious social calculation. They are scanning the room, reading signals, assessing where they stand relative to others. Not consciously, not maliciously, but automatically. The way the body regulates temperature without the mind's involvement. This is not a cynical observation. It is a biological one. We are social animals. We evolved inside group structures where position mattered enormously, where rank determined access to resources, safety, and survival. The neural architecture that ran those calculations has not vanished. It runs silently, beneath awareness, in every social interaction you have ever had. And one of the things it produces, frequently, reliably, often without anyone intending it, is a behavior I would call status testing. A small act, a minor violation, not enough to provoke a confrontation, but enough to gather information. The test is simple. Does this person defend their position, or do they yield? And your response, whatever it is, becomes data. Now here is the part that makes most people uncomfortable when they first hear it. The person testing you is usually not fully aware they are doing it. I want to be precise about this because it is important. I am not saying that disrespectful people are simply misunderstood. I am not saying that bad behavior should be excused. What I am saying is that a great deal of what we experience as deliberate disrespect is actually operating below the level of conscious intention. The colleague who interrupted you did not wake up that morning and think, "I will undermine this particular person today." The friend who routinely makes jokes at your expense is not sitting down each evening to plan your humiliation. The spouse who consistently dismisses your concerns is not executing a calculated campaign of contempt. But the behavior continues nonetheless. And the reason it continues is not because they are monsters. It is because the pattern has never been interrupted. Think about it differently for a moment. Imagine a boundary as a physical fence around a property. If there is no fence, if there is no visible marker, people do not necessarily intend to trespass. They simply walk across what appears to be open ground, because nothing told them otherwise. This is how most disrespect actually operates, not through malice, through habit, through the gradual discovery that a particular person's territory is undefended. And once that discovery is made, the behavior becomes normalized. It settles into routine. The group around that person adjusts accordingly. A tone forms, an expectation forms, and what began as a single small test becomes the permanent grammar of how that person is treated. This brings me to the first way of psychologically handling people who disrespect you. And it is not the most obvious one. It is not confrontation. It is not silence. It is something more fundamental than either. It is the interruption of the pattern before it calcifies. Most disrespect patterns do not solidify overnight. They grow slowly, through many small surrenders. Each one individually seems too minor to address. Each one passes, and each one in passing adds one more layer to a structure that eventually becomes very difficult to dismantle. The psychological principle operating here is simple but precise. When a behavior is consistently met with no consequence, that behavior becomes reinforced. Not because people are calculating rewards consciously, but because the mind is always learning from the feedback it receives. And the absence of resistance is itself a form of feedback. What you tolerate becomes the rule others follow, not because they decided on the rule, but because you taught it to them through your consistent non-response. So the first strategy is not dramatic. It does not involve a confrontation or a speech. It is simply the practice of disrupting the small tests early before they solidify into habit. A calm, clear response, not heated, not defensive, simply an unmistakable signal that you noticed what happened and that it is not acceptable. This sounds simple, but for many people it is extraordinarily difficult, and I want to explain exactly why. Here is something I observed frequently in my work with patients. Many people are more afraid of confrontation than they are of humiliation. Read that again because it contains something genuinely unsettling. They will tolerate being diminished, dismissed, and quietly disrespected for months, sometimes years, rather than face a moment of social friction that might make them appear difficult, aggressive, or overly sensitive. Why? Because confrontation carries a risk. The other person might become hostile, the group might turn against you, the relationship might rupture, the conflict might escalate. And the mind, which is fundamentally risk-averse in social situations, often calculates that enduring the disrespect is the safer option. This calculation feels like wisdom. It feels like restraint. It even feels like emotional maturity. But it is almost always a disguise. What it really is, in most cases, is fear wearing the costume of dignity. And here is the uncomfortable implication. When you consistently avoid defending your own position out of fear of social consequences, you do not actually escape those consequences. You simply trade one cost for another. You trade the short-term discomfort of addressing the disrespect for the long-term cost of living under it. And the long-term cost is far heavier. But let me go one layer deeper, because there is something even more revealing underneath this. Why do some people consistently find themselves in these patterns? Why does the same disrespect seem to follow certain individuals from one relationship to the next, one workplace to the next, one social group to the next. This is one of the most important questions in all of social psychology, and the honest answer is one many people resist, because part of the answer lives inside the person receiving the disrespect, not because they deserve it, not because they are weak, but because the signals a person emits through their posture, their hesitations, their willingness to accept small infractions without response, their tendency to explain rather than assert, their habit of apologizing for occupying space. All of these signals form a message, and that message is received, processed unconsciously, and responded to. People do not consciously study you and decide you are an acceptable target, but something beneath consciousness picks up on these signals constantly. The way a dog can sense fear in a person before the person has moved or spoken. The way a crowd orients itself towards someone who moves with certainty and away from someone who doesn't. I spent decades studying what people project without knowing they are projecting it, and the patterns are unmistakable. A person who learned in childhood that their needs were interruptible grows into an adult who waits to be interrupted. A person who was repeatedly dismissed at home learns to pre-apologize before stating an opinion. A person who was raised in an environment of dominance and submission naturally falls into familiar roles, even when those roles are damaging them. These are not character flaws, they are psychological adaptations, learned responses to environments that no longer exist, patterns that once served a purpose, survival in a difficult family, peace in an unpredictable home, and then followed the person into a world where they no longer serve anything except continuity. This is what I called, in a different context, repetition compulsion. The tendency to recreate familiar psychological patterns even when they cause suffering. Not out of masochism, but because the familiar, however painful, feels known. And what feels known feels, on some deep, irrational level, safe. So here is the second strategy for handling disrespect, and it is entirely internal. Recognize the signal you are sending, not the signal you intend to send, not the signal you believe you are sending, the signal your behavior, your body, your hesitations, your habitual concessions are actually communicating. Because there is always a gap between the two. The person who believes they are communicating patience may be communicating passivity. The person who believes they are communicating diplomacy may be communicating fear. The person who believes they are demonstrating grace may be demonstrating to everyone around them that their territory has no fence. This requires a kind of honest self-observation that is genuinely uncomfortable, because it requires looking at your own behavior not as you experience it from inside, but as others observe it from outside. A useful exercise. After an interaction in which you felt disrespected, do not ask yourself only what the other person did. Ask yourself what you did in the 3 exchanges before that. What did you signal? What did you allow? Where did you shrink slightly? Explain where you did not need to explain. Laugh when you did not want to laugh. Most people, when they do this honestly, discover something instructive. Now I want to address a misconception that causes enormous damage. Most people believe that if you respond to disrespect with visible anger, you win the exchange. This is understandable. Anger feels powerful. It feels like assertion. It feels like finally standing up. But in most social situations, visible anger has the opposite effect of what the person intends. Here is why. When you react with strong emotion to a status test, you provide confirmation of 2 things simultaneously. You confirm that the test landed, that the person successfully affected you, and you confirm that your emotional equilibrium is fragile enough to be disturbed by their behavior. Neither of these is the message you want to send. The person who interrupts you in a meeting and receives a calm, measured correction has just learned something about you. That you cannot easily be rattled, that you respond rather than react, that your confidence does not depend on their approval or their behavior. That is a far more powerful signal than anger. But the person who interrupts you and receives an explosive or visibly hurt response has also learned something. They have learned that you are sensitive to status challenges, that you can be destabilized. And if they are someone with dominance impulses, conscious or not, this is precisely the information that will make them do it again. Emotional control is not suppression. I want to be clear about this distinction because it is frequently misunderstood. I am not advising you to pretend you feel nothing. I am not advising you to swallow pain and perform composure. That is not psychological health. That is a different kind of damage. What I am describing is something more precise: the capacity to feel the sting of disrespect and still respond from a place of internal steadiness rather than reactive turbulence. This is the third strategy, and it is perhaps the most powerful one, because it disrupts something the disrespectful person did not expect. They expected to destabilize you, and when you remain stable, not cold, not aggressive, but genuinely steady, the entire dynamic shifts, because the test has failed, and a test that fails is rarely repeated in the same way. Let me describe someone you may recognize. A man in his early 50s, highly competent, 25 years of professional experience, and in his new workplace, a colleague half his age speaks to him with a particular tone, not overtly hostile, but slightly condescending, slightly too familiar, a tone that carries an implied assumption about whose ideas are more relevant. The older man says nothing. He tells himself it is simply a generational difference, that the younger person is brash but not malicious, that he is above taking offense. But over months, something happens. The younger colleague's tone does not soften, it amplifies. Other colleagues begin to adopt a similar register. Meetings where the older man speaks are increasingly characterized by quick pivots away from his contributions. He feels it. He cannot name it precisely, but he feels it. What happened? The older man made a common and understandable error. He interpreted his own silence as dignity and as patience. But the people around him interpreted it as something else entirely. They interpreted it as confirmation that the hierarchy the younger colleague was attempting to install was accepted. Every unanswered test is a boundary confirmed absent. And here is the part of this that I find most worth examining. The older man's silence was not cowardice. He was not afraid. He genuinely believed he was demonstrating that he was secure enough to not need to defend himself. But security, as a psychological state, is only visible through behavior. The mind of another person cannot read your internal certainty. They can only read your actions. This is a crucial distinction. You can feel completely secure and still signal insecurity through your behavioral patterns. Because the signals that others read are not your feelings, they are your choices. This leads me to the fourth strategy. Enforce your position through behavior, not through explanation. Many people, when they feel disrespected, respond by explaining themselves. They provide evidence of their competence. They offer longer justifications for their positions. They work harder to be understood, to be seen, to be validated. And this approach, while psychologically understandable, tends to worsen the dynamic. Because in a social hierarchy interaction, explanation often reads as justification, and justification reads as uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the clearest signals of lower status position. The person of genuine authority does not usually feel the need to explain why they deserve to be heard. They simply hold their position. They do not pursue the respect of the person testing them. They respond, or they do not respond, from a place that communicates clearly, I have not moved, and I do not need to justify why. Think of it this way. Imagine two people respond to an insult. The first person launches into an explanation of why the insult was unfair, provides counter-evidence, lists their credentials, wants the other person to understand how the comment was hurtful. The second person looks at the insulter calmly and says simply, "That is not something I agree with," then continues. Which of those responses communicates strength? Not because the second person said the right clever thing, but because the second person's response revealed that their sense of position was not dependent on the other person's concession. You cannot negotiate for respect. You can only communicate that you have it, or that you don't. Now I want to talk about the people who genuinely do not intend to disrespect, but do so repeatedly, because they deserve a different kind of attention. There is a category of behavior I have observed throughout my clinical work that I would describe as ego defense through devaluation. The mechanism works like this. A person who feels internally insecure about their competence, their status, their intelligence, their worth, experiences a quiet but constant anxiety. And one of the ways that anxiety is managed unconsciously is by reducing the perceived stature of the people around them. If I can make you slightly smaller in the eyes of others, I feel slightly larger by comparison. If I can introduce just enough doubt about your judgment, my own judgment feels more secure. If I can establish through humor or interruption or subtle dismissal that your ideas are not quite as credible as mine, then my ideas feel safer. This is not cruelty in the classical sense. It is self-protection wearing the mask of dominance. The man who constantly contradicts you at dinner parties is often not contemptuous of you. He is afraid of being seen as less intelligent than you. The colleague who subtly undermines your presentations is often not your enemy. She is frightened of being eclipsed. The friend who cannot resist the slightly cutting remark when you succeed is not malicious. He is managing envy that he does not know how to acknowledge directly. Understanding this does not mean you must tolerate the behavior. It does not mean you should excuse it or absorb it or minimize its effect on you. But it does change how you respond to it, because a response designed to punish cruelty is different from a response designed to neutralize insecurity. The fifth strategy follows directly from this. When disrespect comes from a place of insecurity, the most effective psychological response is not to meet it with aggression, but to refuse to participate in the diminishment dynamic at all. Practically, this means something specific. When someone attempts to reduce your status through subtle devaluation, a dismissive comment, a joke at your expense, an interruption, a condescending explanation, you have several choices. You can escalate, you can capitulate, or you can do something that often works far better than either. You can respond in a way that simply does not register the diminishment as having landed, not with artificial warmth, not with exaggerated nonchalance, but with a specific kind of social steadiness that communicates, "Your attempt to establish yourself above me has not changed my position. I remain where I was. You may continue." This response is deeply destabilizing to someone whose behavior is driven by insecurity, because what they expected was either a wound or a concession. The wound would confirm their power. The concession would confirm the hierarchy they were trying to install. But a response that neither wounds nor concedes, that simply continues without acknowledging the maneuver, gives them nothing to work with. This is not passive. This is one of the most active things you can do socially. It requires a very particular kind of internal stability. And that internal stability, ironically, is its own communication. There is one more category of disrespect I have not yet addressed, and I want to address it carefully because it involves something more painful than any of the others. There is disrespect that comes from people who know you well. Partners, children, close friends, people who once treated you with care and somewhere along the way stopped. This form of disrespect carries a different weight than the workplace interruption or the social acquaintance's cutting remark. Because it does not simply challenge your external position, it challenges something you believed was established, something you thought was safe. And this form of disrespect is, in my experience, the most likely to produce learned patterns of tolerance. Because when the disrespect comes from someone you love, or someone you once loved, or someone whose regard still matters to you, the psychological calculus shifts dramatically. The fear is no longer simply social awkwardness. It is abandonment. It is the loss of connection. It is the possibility that defending your dignity might cost you the relationship itself. And so many people, quietly, gradually, with considerable inner pain, choose the relationship over the dignity. I understand this choice. I have heard it described in many variations by many people across many years. I do not dismiss it. But I want you to see it clearly for what it is, because when you consistently sacrifice your dignity to preserve a relationship, you are not actually preserving the relationship. You are preserving its shell. You are maintaining the external form of the connection while allowing the internal quality of it to hollow out. And the person with whom you are choosing to remain, the one whose disrespect you are absorbing, is learning, slowly and indelibly, that you will absorb it. This is not a relationship. It is an arrangement in which one person has discovered that the other can be diminished without consequence. And both people suffer under it. Even the one who is doing the diminishing, because on some level, a person cannot truly respect what they know they can diminish without resistance. The respect that matters, the deep, genuine regard between two people, cannot survive in the absence of boundaries. Which brings me to the sixth strategy, and it is the most important one. The sixth strategy is not a tactic for a specific moment. It is a long-term psychological posture. It is the commitment to regard your own dignity as non-negotiable, not as something to be defended aggressively, not as something to be performed, but as something that simply exists, as fact, not as negotiation, and whose existence is communicated through every pattern of your behavior, consistently, over time. Respect is not something you request. It is not something you convince people to give you. It is something you establish through the cumulative weight of how you respond, what you accept, what you address, what you walk away from, what you refuse to laugh at when it is not funny, what you will not absorb in silence simply to avoid discomfort. The people in your life are not studying your words. They are studying your patterns. A person who occasionally states firmly that they expect to be treated respectfully and then spends the other 95% of their time tolerating the opposite has communicated nothing useful. What they have communicated, through their behavior, is that the occasional firm statement was performance. But a person who consistently, quietly, without drama or aggression, simply does not accommodate disrespect, who responds calmly and holds their position, who does not explain or justify or over-apologize, who walks away from situations that diminish them rather than enduring them out of social obligation. That person builds something over time. They build a reputation that operates even when they are not present, that exists in how people speak about them, how people treat them in groups, how people consider before they act in their vicinity. This is what I mean when I say respect is communicated, not requested, and it is built slowly, through 1,000 small moments where you chose your dignity over your comfort. Let me return now to where we began, that small moment, the joke that landed slightly wrong, the interruption, the dismissal, the comment with just enough edge to sting, and the choice you made in that moment to let it pass. I told you at the beginning that this was not maturity, that it was not dignity, that the silence taught something you did not intend.